Hey guys, I'm back to you again. I'm going to start reading chapter 2 here a little bit. Back here at the old homestead, things look a little quiet here. Just want to share with you something kind of cool. You guys recognize this bad boy? And get to work. All right. Well, sorry about that. All right, here we go. Just want to share with you. Here we are in beautiful downtown Rice County. Okay, and here's where Charlie Goddard's from, Winona, Minnesota, right there on the river in Winona County. He said he's only been 5 miles either direction. So, not exactly the most exciting of times for young Charlie. Kind of a cool poster I have set up here about the Civil War. I'll be sharing this with you as time went on. At the time of the Civil War, here was the President of the United States, Mr. Lincoln. Now, of course, after the South seceded, they formed their own country called the Confederate States of America, and they elected their own president. His name is Jefferson Davis. So the Civil War is from 1861 to 1865, and we're going to talk about some of these things on here in a little bit. Right now, just wanted to get back to you to chapter number 2. So, here we go. Fort Snelling. They didn't have uniforms for him. There was a pair of black pants that were so short his calves showed, a pair of gray socks, and a black felt hat. That was the uniform he received to go for a soldier. Socks and pants were stout, but the hat was cheap. And with the first little sprinkle, it sagged around his head and drooped over his face. They took his name. The colonel of the regiment read a list of things he couldn't do. He could not desert his post. He couldn't traffic with the enemy. He couldn't steal from his fellow soldiers, and he couldn't act immoral or without decency. And then he signed his name. Told him he was 18, and they didn't challenge it. And he was a soldier. He could read and write. Charlie could. Though he hadn't had much schooling, his ma had made him stick to reading and writing, and he wrote her letters telling her of how it was to be a soldier. So here's Charlie. Remember, how old is he in reality? That's right, he's 15. You got that one right? Here's what you get. A virtual baby Ruth. Sorry, I'll eat it later. So he lied about his age, and that's why he walked all the way from Winona to Fort Snelling, because if he were to sign up in his hometown of Fort Snelling, what would happen? Well, as soon as he walked in to get signed up, they would recognize who he was, and he'd get sent to be a drummer boy, which you didn't want to do that. If you wanted to be a soldier, if you were sent into the Civil War, drummer boys were really young. We'll talk about that later. They were very young, and usually they were not armed when they went into the war. So Charlie wanted to go in to be a soldier. And why did he want to be a soldier? Because he was looking for excitement. We'll come back to that one too later on as the book goes on. Think about that. He was bored with his life, and he signed up, joined the war because he's looking for excitement. Now, you guys and girls are much younger than 15. You know what happens to people who go to war. Yeah, you're right. There's a chance you can get shot, or worse, killed. Or worse yet, kill somebody else. So, I don't think Charlie spent too much time thinking about that. Anyway, back to the book. The food is bad, he wrote his mother. Beef so gamey that dogs won't eat it. And hard beans. Think about that. They're being served food that's so bad, dogs won't eat it. I don't know about you, but I have a dog at home, and she'll eat almost anything. If a dog wouldn't eat something and it's served to you, that's doesn't sound very fun. We boil the beans and use them for a meal. Then use the leftover beans for soup the next day, and on the third day, take any cooked beans that are left. We dry them and crush them and boil them for coffee. The men don't like them much, and there's talk of hanging the commissary officer. It ain't but just talk. But some don't smile when they say it. So, this is kind of gross too. Not only is the beef bad, but they eat beans. And, I'm talking about pork and beans. And they take those leftover pork and beans and they dry them out. And they use them for coffee. Now, why the heck would they do that? Let you think about that for a little bit. Well, coffee is something that they needed all the time. They drank a lot of coffee. And the reason why they drank a lot of coffee is because the water quality was terrible. Now, you and I know that if you're thirsty, we live in an age of really good water. I mean, we go get bottled water or we get filtered water, and every time we drink it, we don't give it a second thought. It's clear and it's crisp and it satisfies our thirst. Well, back during the Civil War, they didn't have bottled water. Unfortunately, they drank water from wherever they could get it, and sorry about this, but sometimes they got it out of places that were pretty disgusting, like maybe even what we would call a mud puddle. They'd kind of go ahead and move the floaties aside in it, fill up their canteen and drink it. Well, guess how that water would taste? You're right, it tasted terrible. So to cover up the taste, you made coffee out of your water. So instead of tasting the gross dirt, you'd taste the coffee. Well, unfortunately, they'd run out of coffee quite a bit. So what would you use instead of coffee? Beans. You took the beans, you dried them out, and then you made coffee out of them. If you ever made coffee, what you do is you go ahead and take your coffee and you pour hot water and you catch the drippings. That's coffee. Well, they do the same thing. Instead of using coffee, they used beans. You used whatever you had back then, and you made do with what you had. So it wasn't a pleasant time, but that's where it was. Back to the book. So there wasn't much of a war yet. Charlie decided early on, but there was a lot of play acting, and once he got inside, he found it mostly boring. Remember, he's after excitement. That's why he signed up. They did something they called drills and a manual of arms, working in the hot sun in the compound area of Fort Snelling until they were soaked with sweat, and Charlie felt he could snap his rifle from left shoulder heft to right shoulder heft, as good as any man in the Army had ever done it. I'll talk to you about that too later. They fired some, but there wasn't much ammunition, and when the sergeants tried to make them hit targets a quarter mile off, Charlie nearly laughed. He'd hunted his whole life and knew about shooting, but the rifles they were issued were .58 caliber muskets that fired a hollow base bullet called a Manet ball, named after the Frenchman who invented it. Let me go ahead and take a little time out here if you indulge me, and I'll show you something that I got. And I'm really bummed out I can't show this to you live, because I know you guys and girls get a huge kick out of it. I was in Virginia on vacation with my wife a few years ago, and I came across this bad boy, if you can see it. Here it is. This is a Manet ball, .58 caliber. And if you know anything about weapons, this is the diameter. 58 indicates the diameter of the bullet, a little over half of an inch in diameter. This is 1 solid ounce of lead. Now this is not a bullet that's in danger of going off, because all this is merely lead. There's no gunpowder, obviously. Where's the gunpowder? Well, thank you for asking. I'll share that with you in just a second. But this is Manet ball, and this is a brand new thing for the Civil War. This was fired out of a rifled musket. You might want to go ahead and Google rifled musket if you got a chance, because it's pretty cool. Before this time, rifled musket, what it does is it has grooves cut in the inside of the barrel, and what that allows is it allows the bullet to spin as it comes out. And a spinning bullet is going to go farther and more accurate than a non-rifled barrel. So this is a Manet ball. Okay, and it's 1 solid ounce. People, this is heavy, very heavy. Here's my pen for scale. And it's a big honker. Okay? If that thing hits you, it would take off your arm. During the Civil War, there are a lot of amputations. A ton of them. So, again, here's my little Baby Ruth thingy. Here's that bullet. That'll give you some idea of how big that honker is. Pretty big. And I also want to share with you, if I could, I'll get back to the book. Trust me on this. Sorry about this delay, but I got to share this with you. Here's the book I got when I was on that vacation too. Civil War Bullets, Beginner's Guide to the Bullets they had. And in here we're going to look for 58 caliber Manet ball. Okay? It says during the Civil War, many types of bullets were fired from several hundred different types of weapons. It is estimated that over 7 million bullets were used during the 3 days of the fighting at Gettysburg alone. Now, Gettysburg was a famous battle that happened in July of 1863. We'll talk about that later on. But that's just in one battle. It's a 3-day battle, Gettysburg. 7 million in one battle. Yikes. During the Civil War, bullets were made primarily in factories. A factory worker using machine could make as many as 3,000 bullets an hour. Prior to 1860, a soldier sometimes needed to make bullets by hand in the field. To do this, he would melt lead into a liquid over a fire and pour it into molds. After allowing the lead to cool and harden, the soldier would take it out of the mold and then scrape the new bullet with a knife to smooth away any rough edges. This way of making bullets not only took a long time, but also meant a soldier could only make a few bullets in an hour. Bullets made during the Civil War were made of lead and weighed between 1 and 1.5 ounces. That's the weight of 8 quarters, people. Still, there are no written rules or standards for making a bullet. It's difficult to say just how many varieties of bullets were made and used. We do know that we can classify all the varieties of bullets using 2 general characteristics: its length and its caliber, which is the diameter of the bullet. But that's not all. It's important to note that bullets could be either completely smooth or have grooves etched in them. Grooved bullets could be found as few as 1 groove or as many as 7. It can be said that most of the bullets used during the Civil War were pointed on one end and shot from a rifled barrel, features which made the bullets more accurate. When a lead bullet is fired in dirt for a long time, it will often rust to the color of white. Rust on a bullet is created by a chemical process called oxidation, and since all the bullets used in the Civil War are now over 130 years old, most of them will be rusted white when found. This bad boy is not rusted white. All right, I'm going to skip ahead here. Here we go. Here's what it looks like in bigger scale. Here's got the point, here's got the ring, and here's the base. Now, we all know about germs, since, that's not why we're not in school, because of germs. And one thing that was really interesting, when a soldier loaded this thing, they handled the bullet with their fingers, and they got a lot of bacteria on there. And when this thing was fired, it hit the enemy soldier. And one of the things, if the soldier was lucky enough to survive the wound, one thing they had to contend with was bacteria or infection. And that's before they had antibiotics. So unfortunately, one of the reasons why they just amputated either a leg or an arm was simply because it was easier than trying to treat an infection. Creepy. Anyway, this is what they got. So you're a Civil War soldier, and this is what you got. This is called a cartridge. Where did I put my pen? Doggone it. Oh, there it is. Here we go. This is a cartridge, all right? So, and this is a Union. Remember, there's two sides in the Civil War. We have the Union, which is the North, and the Confederates, which is the South. So the Union mini balls, this is a paper cartridge, people. And inside that paper cartridge, you had the bullet, which is this bad boy right here. Okay? Move that baby roof. That's the bullet. And then you had the black powder. All right? And this is what, this casing here, they kept in a little leather belt around their waist. This was the musket, the 1861 Springfield rifled musket, or the 1863 Springfield rifle musket. Okay? The .58 caliber Union mini ball was the most widely used bullet in the Civil War, named after its creator, Captain Claude Etienne Menet of the French Army. The Menet ball is not round as its name suggests. See? Sorry, you couldn't see that. My bad. It's not technically round. This bullet was perfected in 1848 and officially adopted by the United States Army in 1855. The rings were added to the design by the Americans. The rings held grease to help ease the bullet down the barrel, as well as collect powder residue when fired. Mini balls, or mini balls, were extremely accurate within 350 yards. 350 yards, people. That's 3.5 football fields. Although they could travel as far as 1,500 yards. Yikes. A large star stamped on the base of some of the bullets indicates that the bullet was made at the Washington, D.C. arsenal. Okay, so how would this work? So you're a Civil War soldier, a Union soldier. What you would do is take this cartridge, put it in your mouth, bite off the paper. All right, you take that bullet out, and you take the black powder. Underneath here on the rifle was a long rod. Underneath the barrel was called a tamping rod. So you take that skinny rod out, like a long metal rod, and you pour this black powder down the barrel of the rifle. Okay? Sorry, first you'd probably blow down that rifle, because if you just shot it, it'd be hot, and you'd want to go ahead and cool that barrel, because if it was red hot and you poured gunpowder down it, you'd ruin your day. Yeah, kaboom. So you'd cool that thing first, or wait for it to cool. Pour the black powder down there. Take the ball and put it down the barrel, and you take the rod and you push the ball down. Then there's a little piece of wadding in there, a little piece of paper, and you take that piece of paper and you shove it to the top of the bullet all the way to the bottom of that barrel. Okay? So that's how you reload it. A 1861 or 1863 Springfield rifled musket. Now, if you're really good, really, really good, you could do it 3 times in a minute or 20 seconds. 20 seconds is an awful long time to be reloading a weapon, because what's happening during those 20 seconds while you're reloading your weapon? Yeah, you guessed it. Somebody's trying to kill you. Okay? So, that's why before these soldiers went off to fight, the Army spent a whole lot of time training them how to fire that weapon. Because if they didn't know how to fire the weapon in training, they sure as shooting weren't going to learn how to fire it during the stress and anxiety of battle. Capiche? All right, here we go. Sorry about that. Back to our live book. Here's our mini doohinkies there. So, where the heck did I leave off? The rifles thundered, but lacked the flat crack of his smaller bore hunting rifle. and he found that nearly a third of the time the bullets seemed to fly end over end, and it was all he could do to hit a target 50 yards off. A quarter mile over 400 yards? That sounds silly. But they practiced anyway, and stood and fired and dropped to one knee, and the next rank stood and fired and dropped. They reloaded by biting the end off the paper cartridge, pouring the powder down the bore, and setting the bullet on the powder with the ramrod. Ramrod, not tamping rod. I'm sorry. I got the nomenclature wrong. Then they put a cap on the nipple, the hammer back, and they fired again. And they said a man could do it 3 times a minute, but Charlie somehow never managed to do it more than twice. So if Charlie can only do it twice a minute, it's taking him 30 seconds to reload. Oh my gosh. That's an eternity, people. 30 seconds? You're on a battlefield, people are screaming and yelling and dying next to you, and you're reloading your weapon? Yikes. When they couldn't afford to expend any more live ammunition, they practiced with empty rifles again and again, until Charlie was sick to death of the drilling and wheeling and marching and fake loading. It would be different, he thought, if the leaders knew what they were doing. But the officers and the sergeants had been civilians like the rest of the men, and mostly had been elected by the men themselves, and had to learn as they went along, using an Army manual for close order drill. It seemed all they did was drill and sweat and listen to sergeants and corporals bellow at them. And as the weeks passed, Charlie grew more and more bored and was beginning to pay attention to his mother's letters. She had taken to thinking of the bad side of the war and was in fear that Charlie would get killed, and wrote 3 times a week. "I know it ain't right," she wrote in one letter, "but you must think I'm coming home now. Just leave the Army and walk home before they get you in a battle and shoot you apart." So Charlie's own mother is asking him to do something. What's she asking him to do? Like most of the men, Charlie doubted there would ever be a battle. Minnesota was mostly wild then, with Sioux and Chippewa Indians to the north and the west, and there were some frontier forts on the edge of the wilderness to deal with any difficulties. These posts were manned by regular Army troops, which Lincoln needed now to fight in the war, and there was talk in the ranks that the Minnesota Volunteers would be used to replace the Army troops at the frontier forts so the regular Army could go east to fight. "It'd be all mosquitoes and muck," a corporal named Massey said during a break in drilling one afternoon. "They don't let me go fight the rebels, I might pull foot and leave." It was all rumor, of course, but what with his mother's letters, she wrote more often all the time of deserting, the boredom of the constant drilling in the hot sun, and now the talk of being sent to relieve the frontier forts so that the regular Army troops could go fight the rebels. And who are the rebels? Yep, the rebels are another name for the soldiers fighting in the South. The Confederacy were rebelling against the United States, so they were called rebels. The North, the Union, those soldiers were also called the Yankees. Charlie was nearly on the edge of leaving when on June the 22nd they were called into formation, ordered to get all their gear, and they marched to the river, where steamboats were waiting to take them to St. Paul. There they marched through town with great fanfare. They still didn't have proper uniforms, but they'd all been issued red flannel shirts. And though those shirts were as hot as original sin, as Charlie heard them described, at least the men looked like a unit, marching with shouldered rifles and hats cocked forward. Girls waved flags and people yelled, "Go to it, boys! Get the rebels! Don't stop till you hit Richmond." Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. It wasn't far from Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. In a short time, they boarded other steamboats, and they took them south and east to La Crosse, Wisconsin, where trains were waiting for them. So Charlie, don't forget, he's at Fort Snelling, which is St. Paul. He took a steamboat down the Mississippi River to La Crosse, Wisconsin, where he jumped on a train. It was all new to him. Charlie had never ridden on a steamboat, never marched in a parade, or had pretty girls wave flags for him and hand him sweets. Now as he boarded the train and saw the plush seats and the fancy inside of the car, he thought, I just never imagined that such a thing existed. It was, all in all, a simply grand way to go off to fight in a war. See you in chapter 2.